So I am presenting a research that was recently published that was done by Melissa Lewis and myself as lawyers, together with a number of people, biologists from Wild Crew at University of Oxford, who actually know about lions and their conservation needs. So we teamed up to look at the role and the relevance of all kinds of international legal instruments for the conservation and sustainable use of lions. And for me, looking at large carnivores and international law started some time back. I've done most of my research in the past on European large carnivores and the legal frameworks applicable to them. And then in 2015, I took a sort of broad brush, bird's eye view look at the relevance of international law generally for the world's largest carnivores. And then now this lion research really goes into depth for one of those species. Now, as you know better than I do, lions are not faring well as a species, whereas in southern African states the trend is stable or slightly increasing. In West Africa the trend is very, very alarming, and also in East Africa. So overall lions are declining, the range is contracting. Of course, apart from the African populations, there's a small population in India that is not on this map. Overall vulnerable status on the IUCN Red List, critically endangered status for the West African lions, and the Asian lions having an endangered status at the moment. Main threats mentioned in the research on the topic are the depletion of the prey base of lions, human-lion conflict, the mortality that produces, habitat loss, and various other potential threats. Trophy hunting, when not well regulated, can be a threat to populations depending on where you are. And the lion bone trade that was discussed this morning already, if not well regulated, depending on how the market functions, can be a trigger of lion poaching in various parts of the species range. So the CITES COP last year in Johannesburg and the conference of the parties of the Convention on Migratory Species that was held just a few weeks ago in the Philippines had lions clearly in the limelight, but those two conventions are certainly not the only relevant conventions for lion conservation and management. And so this is an overview of some of the most relevant treaties. They include the big 5 global wildlife conventions, so the Ramsar Wetlands Convention, the World Heritage Convention, CITES on international trade and endangered species, the CMS being the Convention on Migratory Species, the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, and a range of regional instruments, including the African Convention on Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, the SADC Protocol on Wildlife Conservation and Law Enforcement, treaties establishing transfrontier conservation areas, and several others. And we'll have a look at some of them to illustrate. Most lion range states are parties to most of the relevant conventions, so participation is generally high. This map shows the participation in the 5 global treaties, showing that most lion range states are parties to all 5 of these, or at least 4 of them, of these global treaties. And when thinking about international legal instruments, treaties, us lawyers typically first think of the legal binding obligations in the instruments and the extent to which parties are complying with those, and if they're not complying, something should be done about it. If possible, take them to court. That's the sort of thinking that we're taught to do. Interpret the obligations, what exactly do they require? But it's good to realize that apart from that dimension, which is certainly an important one, There are many other dimensions to international treaties. So it's not only top-down obligations, but it's also a lot of bottom-up cooperation between governments, non-governmental stakeholders, non-governmental and governmental stakeholders getting together. These treaties and their regular meetings are also meeting places for sharing expertise and the latest scientific findings, best practices, and so on. And apart from that, they provide a measure of long-term stability, as treaties are less easily changeable than national domestic laws. So the World Heritage Convention is a global convention that most of you will be familiar with, asking contracting parties, which include most of the world's states, and certainly the Lion Range states, to identify the natural heritage on their territories and to conserve it. And a selection of those areas, the ones that are of outstanding universal value, can be nominated by parties, and then the World Heritage Committee decides on whether to include those sites in the World Heritage List. And inclusion in that list is a prestigious affair, and once sites are listed, that gives them an added layer of protection, but also a lot of prestige. So when harmful developments are being considered, the World Heritage status of a site can typically put quite a bit of weight in the scale of whether to allow such potentially harmful developments. So we identified 18 sites that are on the World Heritage List and that are important or potentially important to lion conservation. So most of these sites are, for most of these, the presence of lions was one of the factors that motivated their inclusion in the World Heritage List. So that entails that in implementing their obligations, parties must pay attention to what's going on with lions in those sites. In some of these sites, lions have disappeared, but of course the conservation of the site would guarantee the continuation of the prey base, conserve the habitat, make sure that that area remains a natural area where in the future lions could return. This is a map of the various areas. So the red dots are the locations of these World Heritage sites that are of significance for lions. And I'll give a few illustrations of what that can mean in practice. In the Serengeti National Park, the authorities for some years now have been considering upgrading the road through the natural area, upgrading it into a Serengeti superhighway, and this was the subject of a court case before the Court of the East Africa Community, so an international court. And in looking whether allowing this superhighway through the Serengeti was a lawful decision, the court heavily looked at the World Heritage status of the Serengeti site, and that was a decisive factor in reaching the judgment that Tanzania would be acting contrary to its international obligations if it allowed the road. So that's a concrete illustration of the significance that World Heritage status can have for site conservation. Another way in which sites can benefit is not through the route of typical law and court cases, but through technical assistance. So by being a World Heritage site, that opens up possibilities in terms of receiving technical assistance and funding for achieving the conservation objectives of the sites in question. And Niokolo-Koba in Senegal is a good example for lions there. For example, the UNESCO financed, I think, 100 camera traps to monitor the lion and wild dog population. So it's a very concrete and way in which lions can also benefit from this international legal status of the area where they live. And countries, it's a procedure of various steps for sites to end up on the World Heritage List. First, countries draw up so-called tentative lists of World Heritage sites on their territories, and from those lists, then they in future nominate concrete sites that then go through the procedure of the World Heritage Committee. So we also looked at the tentative lists of World Heritage in the various lion range states and came up with this list of areas that the inclusion of which in future could benefit the lions present in those sites. And that's another future avenue for potentially having lions benefit from the World Heritage Convention. Broadly similar considerations apply to the other site-based treaty, the Ramsar Wetlands Convention. So a convention focusing on the conservation of wetlands. And of course, lions are not your typical wetland-dependent species, but the definition of wetlands in the convention and the way it's been applied allows for the protection and requires the protection of a range of areas that also have lions resident. And so the Wetlands Convention also has its list. It requires its parties to conserve and wisely use the wetlands on their territory, and to include wetlands in the list of wetlands of international importance. So we perform the same exercises with the World Heritage Convention, looking at the sites that lion range states have included in the list of wetlands of international importance, and seeing which one of those are relevant to lions. Again, finding that in many of those cases, 24 of the 39 sites, the presence of lions was a concrete one part of the reason for that state to include the site in the wetland list. And that would, again, put weight in the scale of concretely filling in the parties' obligations to conserve that site. So making sure that lions remain a vital part of those wetlands. In these areas, some of them are small, but some of them are huge floodplains, like the Kafue Flats, Zambezi floodplains, etc. Very large areas. And here again, in this case, it's the black dots indicating the locations of all those sites. Now, CITES has already been discussed to some extent this morning, having lions split listed. So the Asiatic part of the population is in Appendix 1 with strict prohibition in principle of commercial trade, but the African lions are in Appendix 2, but with the annotation since the Johannesburg COP of, as discussed this morning in the plenary, of the zero quota for the wild-sourced lion bones, skeletons, teeth, etc., and the quota for South Africa for the captive-sourced. Other than the lion bone trade, CITES is obviously relevant for the international flow of hunting trophies, but also for the broader lion conservation agenda. The two regional lion conservation strategies were drafted by the IUCN and various other partners in 2006 at the instigation of the CITES Conference of the Parties, and these strategies take a very broad focus that goes way beyond the trade aspect. And also CITES, jointly with the CMS, hosted, organized in 2016, a meeting of the lion range states in which most of the lion range states got together in Entebbe and drew up a communique on actions needed. Then there's a range of regional instruments that I won't go into the details of, other than stressing the importance of transfrontier conservation areas. So the treaties establishing those are clearly crucial treaties amongst all the treaties that are relevant to lions. And then finally, the Convention on Migratory Species has a natural role to play, given that in terms of the material scope, the other instruments have their limitations. So World Heritage is limited to areas of outstanding natural value. Ramsar is limited to wetlands. And in terms of spatial scope, the regional instruments are limited to various sections of lion range. But there's not the overarching framework, and that can be offered by the CMS, in which lions were agreed to be listed at the very latest COP. So it will take a few more months for that to enter into force, but technically lions are now on their way to Appendix 2, which allows more cooperation. But Melissa Lewis will fill you in on the relevance of the CMS, because I have to wrap up by saying that obviously there are many legal instruments that are of relevance to lions, that it is worthwhile investing in a clever, wise way to see where they can benefit lions the most. Thank you.